welcome to our talk. Welcome to our first Black Hat talk. I'd like to mention that too, in case we screw up something and you have tomatoes on your hands. I mean, just keep them for the end. My name is Michalis Magnetakos, and I'm an assistant professor with New York University in Abu Dhabi. And I'm here joined by Tassos Keliris and Haris Konstantinou. All three of us will give this talk today. So before I start, I'd like actually to start with a disclaimer that during this presentation we have interacted with various stakeholders, but everything we're here presenting is just our opinion and our findings, and we're here representing New York University and NYU. The second thing I want to get out of the way at the beginning is that this presentation is information we have found on the internet. It's publicly available information. Still, there are some parts that we believe that should not be on the internet. So for these, we don't present them and we mask the information that could potentially lead to finding them. So the outline of this talk, what this talk is about. This talk has two distinct parts that will be delivered by each of my colleagues here. The first one is that it's a research effort in a lab setting, right? I want to get this clear immediately that all of this work has happened in the lab. And during that research, we try to understand, identify, and assess information about the power grid that appears on the internet that's publicly available. During the course of this exercise, we have informed stakeholders, we raised awareness, and if we found something that we didn't think should exist, we asked people to take it down. So it has happened during this research effort. And the second part, that will be the demo here, is a presentation of vulnerability on this G750 device that we disclosed to General Electric, and a patch came out last year in 2016. So we're also here presenting that vulnerability. So let me start from the beginning and how we ended up at Black Hat here today. Back in 2014, we started building a smart city testbed at New York University in Abu Dhabi. And the point behind the testbed was to understand security and privacy concerns for future smart cities. As we expect everything to become more interconnected, we'd like to have a proper training and research environment to test our methodologies and to train future cybersecurity experts. And the definition of a smart grid can be, well, anything you like it to be, something that's more intelligent than yesterday. But how we define it is that it incorporates various smart processes, and they work together seamlessly in a way that increases the efficiency of how the city operates. And I have a few examples of what we have abstracted in our testbed. And smart grid, intelligent transportation, smart house, smart buildings are just some components. There's some photos here. And the construction of this project is how we started working on this whole effort. So I don't really need to motivate the need for security in the ICS landscape, right? That will be boring, and there's enough experts here to understand that there's need for research and for solutions in the ICS security landscape. What I'd like to quickly move to is the fact that we're focused on the smart grid, we're focused on the power grid, and our focus, and we have been focusing on this because this is a cornerstone of all critical infrastructure. If power goes down, all the other critical infrastructure will also be hit by that. And there are also documented cases the last few years that we've seen real attacks on real grids. And there was a talk yesterday, a very informative talk on destroyer or crossover, I don't know what term to use. One of the two, there seems to be a name dispute among the two entities. I have CRASHOVERRIDE because that's the first article I read, but you can call it destroyer. So on that part, I only want to deliver 2 points. The first point is that the cybersecurity for industrial control environment has increased attention because of the increased attack surface caused by the presence of more and more smart devices, right? And in the past, we had most electromechanical components. Now we're moving to to devices that are microprocessor-based, and they're built with commercial off-the-shelf parts. And the 2015 Ukraine incident, it was reported that one of the modems, its firmware was, they had the malicious firmware placed so it can lock the operators out. In 2016, we have a malware, again, CRASHOVERRIDE, that can send packets that is aware of industrial protocols and send packets to those relays and can do something more meaningful than those attacks. So the first point I would like to make is that we're focusing on microprocessor-based devices. And the second is there's a huge, huge, huge difference between trying to understand a localized event in the power grid and try to understand how you would possibly cause a cascading failure or a widespread impact, right? These are very different things, and it has been pointed out yesterday as well. So the grid, the power grid has been there for many years, right? It has been built to be robust against maybe the biggest adversary of all times, which is Mother Nature. So you have the grid being extremely robust. And as it also mentioned by Robert Lee yesterday, there is a lot of synchronization going on. And to be able to cause something more meaningful than just an islanded event or a small-scale event, you really have to understand what's happening, right? And that's not easy. So in this research, what we try to do is to come up with a proper infrastructure that will let us analyze the latter, right? That will let us analyze how, if an adversary is to attack the grid in a much more sophisticated fashion, in a way that will try to cause a cascading failure or a widespread damage, how can we model it and how can we come up with defenses against someone who's spread out in the network? And I was pleased yesterday to hear, again from the Industrial talk, that this malware was not trying to attack synchronicity, right, synchronization. It was just going after substation directly and tried to cause localized damage. So that was good news, because we don't have evidence yet that attackers are trying to cause something more widespread. But still, we have to be ready for it, and we have to develop the right test beds, an accurate test bed that will let us model those attacks and come up with appropriate defenses. So this is where we stopped and asked, to create the test bed, right, we need to buy some of these devices that are employed in the power grid, and we need to come up with an accurate power grid model. We have to come up with a model that will let us do an assessment that's meaningful, right? If you just go after hacking a device, you want to understand what's happening in the actual grid. So the question we're answering today is whether there's enough information publicly available for accurate modeling of the power grid. And this loosely ties to the title of the talk about whether the attacks are nation-state attacks only, or whether behind a laptop you can collect enough information for accurate modeling of the power grid to be able to understand something and deliver an impact that's more than just a localized event. So with this, I'll stop, and Haris will give us more information about the power grid.
Thanks, Mihaly. Hello, everybody. So before trying to answer the question that Mihalis raised, first, it is important to understand the structure of the grid and understand also the requirements for a successful modeling. So as you can see in the slide, the power grid consists of generation stations, transmission lines, and distribution substations, step-down transformers, and distribution lines that carry the voltage in order to be delivered to the different types of consumers. The current grid infrastructure is also equipped with cyber systems nowadays that aim to improve the reliability and the efficiency of the grid. These systems include, among others, communication networks, control automation systems, and the so-called intelligent electronic devices that exist in various parts of the grids, and they aim to improve. They have integrated protection and control functions and communication capabilities for remote operations. Also, these multifunction devices, they observe the state of the system, they make educated decisions, and then they take actions in order to preserve the stability and the performance of the system. For example, substation optimization systems that we can see in this figure are built in such a way these days in order to deliver the timestamp and real-time critical data from these IDs, from these intelligent electronic devices, throughout the utility network. This enhanced data availability helps the utilities to make decisions more accurately and more quickly. the more it goes without saying that the more we depend on electricity, the more we need to protect it. Therefore, the objective of a protection scheme is to keep the power system stable by isolating only those components that are under fault and leaving as much of the network as possible still in operation. The devices that are used to protect power system are called protection devices. They consist of three major parts. They have instrument transformers that are basically current and potential transformers that isolate and transform voltage and current signals. We have protective relays that are basically sense the faults and initiate a trip and disconnection or a close command. And we have circuit breakers that open or close the system based on the relay command. So protective relays in their simplest operation are breaker controllers that they manage the status signals 0 or 1 for the actual breaker if it's close or trip respectively. So as Mihaly stated earlier, the development of an accurate model is essential in the testbed development process because it can allow us to understand the load flow of the problem, assess protection and control functions, identify problems, including outages, and in general understand the threats that can be caused and that can cause widespread blackouts. For a power system model to be sufficient for evaluating, for example, the effects from power outages, it is necessary to be aware of two things. First, we need to know the topology of the network, and also we need to know some of the components parameters. And these can include transmission line parameters, loads, generation, location, ratings, and limits, and other parameters. So given this information, we can use power system analysis software tools in order to model an actual part of the grid based on the type of study and based on the modeling. A particular type of study is named contingency analysis, and it's a major activity in power system planning and operation. In layman terms, contingency analysis is a what-if scenario simulator that evaluates the effects and calculates any overloads on an electric power grid when a problem occurs. Contingency, for example, can be the loss or the failure of a small part of the grid, such as a transmission line, or even an individual component, such as a transformer or a generator. And as you can see in the table, in general, power systems must be able to sustain a single contingency condition for maintenance actual operations. However, there exist locations, there exist a number of contingencies which cannot be sustained sometimes and can lead to cascading failure. Although the probability of having more than two simultaneous contingencies is small, such scenarios do occur and can cause cascading failures and even blackouts. So knowing the details of a particular study that will be carried out, the issue remains where to find in the public domain, online actually, the required data in order to model a real grid. First of all, power system databases are publicly online available, and they provide access to data related to real systems across the globe. For example, Open Power Systems Data Platform provides data regarding power plants, generation capacities, and loads for several European countries. In this table, for example, we can see details of generation stations. I hope you can see, including the name of the station, generation capacity, latitude, longitude, the street, even the address of the generation station. Also, Power Grid Map has a global focus. It's a crowdsource-based project that even has an application that helps towards mapping power grid devices. Another source of information is the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, which provides data regarding maps of transmission networks across Europe, grid interconnection details, historical and forecast flows, and generation capacities, as well as development plans for the next 10 years. Using the data from this platform, for example, one can identify the interconnection transmission links between countries. And using the data can model the technical characteristics of a country's dependencies. For example, if I'm not mistaken, Germany, during the last month, in average, exported more than 3.5 terawatt hours to countries like the Netherlands, Czech Republic, Denmark, and Switzerland. So we can see that the energy trade flows between countries should be taken into consideration in order to create an accurate model of the system. Beyond online databases that are open sources, there also exist databases that they sell information, data, and maps for power systems. And in this figure here, we can see a part of the US generation map. Besides power system databases, a widespread attack and the model of it needs accurate topological information. Therefore, the topology of the system can be constructed or at least validated by observing the components of the system and their interconnections. However, instead of on-the-ground tracking of power system structures, in order to create the topology, one can use satellite images from geographic information systems. And in this slide, we can see 3 examples, one generation station, one transmission substation, and transmission lines as they appear in online geographic information systems. The location of these structures cannot be hidden from orbiting satellites, except in the case of underground cables. However, you should know that the vast majority of transmission lines are overhead. For example, in the US, 97% of transmission lines are overhead. Also, oftentimes power utilities, transmission system operators, or even government agencies release reports to the public that have operational details regarding a power system. These reports might be in the forms of reports required by the law, annual financial reports that need to be shared with the shareholders, or even planning statements. A particular report that we found online has a detailed representation of a country's transmission network topology, along with the transmission system dataset. For example, it had the KV and MVR ratings of generations, generators, transient synchronous reactance, transformers leakage impedance, types of cables, and even 3-phase and 1-phase short circuit levels of peak load conditions. Also, the study and what we can, the report, and this is the image that we can see here, included a load flow model that helped us understand and validate the model that we created based on the previous data that I mentioned. Also, blackout reports have information, essential information about the power system in an effort sometimes to pinpoint and explain the source of the blackout to the public. In addition, in some cases, reports can have the information, geographical information of electronic control units or intelligent electronic units, such as phasor measurement units, as you can see in this picture provided by the NASPI, the North American Synchrophasor Initiative. We can also extract data regarding a power system from information released to the press, and such information can be, for example, newsletters, press releases by system operators, success stories by the vendors who installed the components in the system, corporate presentations, and even webinars. Some examples are shown here, and they include, for example, control system order details from the media centers of vendors, stories about the supply, install, and commissioning of substations, implementation of transmission substation and lines projects. And also we have found via success stories details that specify the controllers models as well as the communication protocols and network connections someone is using in their distribution network. Also, there are utilities that they stream online their monthly board meetings, and they contain information besides of how their day was, essential information about the design characteristics of the system. So the conclusion from our internet search shows that there exists a wealth of information out there providing enough data to accurately model the grid and enable a widespread blackout or an attack. So, however, even though there is enough information to model an existing part of the grid, due to the sensitive nature of the domain, we'll continue the study and the presentation on a synthetic benchmark that is shown here. What we have here is actually a power word simulation of a synthetic power system. Power word is a power system simulation package that has all the necessary tools to perform tasks like optimal power flow, contingency analysis, fault and sensitivity analysis, etc. The green arrows you can see here are power flows, and we have configured one of the switches in this model, in this power word model, to be controlled by our hardware. And specifically, the switch that we have configured to be controlled by our hardware is 10.7 megawatt load on bus 8. So, model is there. The issue now remains of how to connect the devices for power system modeling. And the solution is creating a hardware-in-the-loop testbed because similar to a real process environments, hardware-in-the-loop for ICS, for industrial control systems in general, connect the system in the loop. So one or more hardware devices, PLC, a relay, or in general electronic control unit are connected to the host computer that runs the simulation model. This allows us to have a flexible, reconfigurable, and modular environment to emulate different conditions, examine several scenarios, and have an accurate to test actual real-world interfaces without the hazards of a production environment. So in our case, and in this setup here, we have a hardware-in-the-loop simulation configuration where the simulation model, it resides in the host computer, which is the laptop over there. And it runs the synthetic model that we showed earlier in PowerWord. And the circuit breaker connections are achieved via MATLAB and LabVIEW in order to connect the actual relay, the hardware relay, through a data acquisition device to the simulation model. So with this setup, we can have realistic studies without the need of replicating all the expensive and bulky equipment. So if you remember in the beginning of the talk, Michalis mentioned that besides the model of the system, we need actual microprocessor-based devices, enabled devices for accurate and proper cybersecurity analysis. Therefore, in this setup, besides the data acquisition device and the software, the control equipment, the actual relay, needs to be purchased. And for that, eBay can be a great solution. What we have here are 4 different industrial devices that we found on eBay. And also, besides eBay, other third-party companies offer used or new data industrial devices for sale. And the majority of these devices, of these listings, concern actually surplus or decommissioned equipment and are typically sold at a fraction of the original price. Before passing the microphone to Tassos, who will describe the details of the device that we purchased from eBay, the table here shows eBay listing statistics that we gathered earlier on May and June 2017. And what we can see here are the listings regarding microprocessor-enabled power grid devices from the 5 vendors with the largest market share. The numbers that you can see indicate that there are plenty of opportunities out there for anybody who wants to play with or in general understand the operation and the internal workings of such critical devices. Tasso?
Thank you, Hari. Now, moving on, my colleagues have talked about how you can go about building a power system model from the ground up, and how you could include hardware and hardware-in-the-loop testbed like the one we have here. I'm going to focus more about the specific testbed that we built. Getting the hardware is an important part, and as we saw, online marketplaces such as eBay are a very good opportunity, and that's what we did. We went out to eBay and bought a relay, specifically the G750 feeder management relay, for about $1,000. And I also have listed here the reason the seller had in the listing. It's a brand new device, never used. It was left over from a project that was canceled, and that's great for us. We got it for cheap, and it works. It's new. But it's interesting at this point to see that besides all the information that's available online that enables you to model a power system, you can also procure devices that perform critical operations relatively easily and relatively for cheap. After procuring the relay, we set out to see how it works. And to do that, we had to play around with the device, and we figured out that one of the main goals of a relay is essentially to control the big switches, the circuit breakers. And it does so by using set points. The specific model uses set points, and set points, you can think of them like variables in programming languages. The relay gets its inputs from the environment by sensing voltage and current signals, and then uses the user programmable, let's say, set points to make decisions, to take decisions, and either control the trip and close commands that sense the circuit breakers. Now, in terms of access to these set points, they are all readable by anyone, any unauthenticated user that has access to the device, either physically or remotely. However, if you want to write back to these set points, if you want to modify the values they contain, you need to provide an 8-digit passcode that essentially authenticates users. Now, to access these set points, you can either do it locally using the front panel and the buttons on the front and read off the values from the LCD display, or you can do it remotely. And one of the protocols this device supports is Modbus, specifically Modbus TCP. And you can issue read register commands to the relay over the network to essentially query specific registers to give you back values for specific set points. But what this device does is it treats the passcode itself as a set point. And it also treats the encrypted passcode as a set point. Now, the encrypted passcode, you can think of it like the ciphertext. It's the result of applying an encryption algorithm on the passcode and deriving the ciphertext. And while the passcode is 8 digits, it's 8 numerical characters, the encrypted passcode consists of 8 alphabetical characters. And another interesting thing we found on the relay's manual is the reset procedure. In case you forget your passcode or you lose it, you could contact General Electric Multilink, provide them your encrypted passcode, and they would give you back your passcode. Now, remember at this point that the encrypted passcode is a set point, and the set points are readable by anyone. So essentially, that means that any authenticated user can extract the ciphertext, the encrypted passcode. And you can do that either locally from the front panel or remotely over Modbus. And that's essentially the first vulnerability we identified in this device, that anyone without any authentication can extract the ciphertext. Locally, to do that, you can use the physical buttons and navigate the menu. You go to set points, relay setup, passcode, encrypted passcode. I think the device now actually shows. No, it doesn't. Now it does. The current encrypted passcode, for those of you who don't have bionic vision, maybe the front rows can attest to that. But if you're a remote user, you could issue a specific read registers command for specific register addresses that you can find which ones in the communications guide of the relay. You can issue a read register command for 4 specific registers that will give you back the value of the encrypted passcode. Now, moving on to break this encryption algorithm, we obtained a bunch of passcodes and encrypted passcode pairs and performed chosen plaintext attack using manual cryptanalysis, and we were essentially able to break it. And what we found out is that it's a homebrew algorithm that can be abstracted as an algorithm that uses linear transformations and that operates in a cipher blockchaining mode, CBC mode, that uses a set IV. It doesn't use a random initialization vector. Now, after having the algorithm that essentially encrypts passcodes to derive the encrypted passcodes, it was trivial to reverse it and obtain the decryption algorithm that would essentially give us the ability to decrypt encrypted passcodes and get the original passcode value. I won't go into too much detail about the inner workings of the algorithm, mainly for two reasons. First, because of the nature of the mitigation that will be discussed later. And secondly, because we're not here to enable script kiddies. But having the ability to decrypt passcodes, what can one do with this? For starters, one might want to ensure persistency on the device. So as the encrypted passcode is a set point, and by having the ability to reverse it and essentially obtain the current passcode, one could unlock the device by reading the encrypted passcode, reversing it, and unlocking the device, and then change the encrypted passcode. And by doing that, one could essentially lock the legitimate operators out so they couldn't undo any of the further changes that could be done to the set points. And then another step could be to change some of the critical set points, causing the device to operate in ways other than the ones that it was configured. And those, for example, could be setting a very low threshold value, such that the device will always set the trip command to the circuit breakers, or set very lax thresholds, let's say, so that the device never issues a trip command. And that's also bad, because you could have a fault propagating through the lines without the protection kicking in place to isolate that fault that could also lead to hardware failures. And finally, you could also have adversary control conditions. However, I want to note that this would require significant knowledge of the system and has several additional prerequisites. It's not that easy to do. In the demo I'm going to show in a while, we're going to make the device to always send the trip command. But before going to the demo, I want to talk a little bit about remotely fingerprinting the device. If you have physical access, you can just read the sticker in the front. You know what kind of device it is. But if you're a remote user, you want to have the ability to be able to fingerprint this device, know whether, for example, it's a G750 relay. And to do that, Modbus offers a read device identification function per the specification that returns things like the vendor name, the product code, and the major and the minor revision. And it would be great if this device supported that, but it doesn't. And that's because Modbus is not a standardized protocol. It's a specification, so vendors implement it in whatever way they see fit. And this device, for example, does not implement the read device identification code. But what I noticed during my research in industrial control systems in general is that vendors typically implement other ways to identify their products, and they do so by putting things like the vendor ID, the model ID, maybe the firmware versions, or other unique IDs in specific reserved Modbus registers. And the addresses of these registers are also vendor dependent, and all this diversity of the different kinds of information that you can have and the different addresses where they're stored can enable us to essentially fingerprint devices, such as this one. And this technique actually works for the 750 relay we have here. What we noticed is that the Windows configuration software called NRVista by General Electric is that it has the ability to identify 750 relays on the network. So we sniffed the traffic between a relay and the configuration software and figured out that, among other things, the configuration software expects the first 2 bytes in register 0, Modbus register 0, to be hex 1B, the value 27. Now, on the table here, I list also the expected values by the respective NRVista version that have to be in place in Modbus register 0 for the device to be identified as one of the device models shown on the left. I also listed the affected firmware versions for some of the affected devices, some of the devices that are affected by the passcode vulnerability I described before. Now, I also, having this fingerprinting technique in place, I performed a search on Shodan Modbus connected devices, and fortunately for everybody, I didn't find any internet connected devices. And that's always a good thing. Now, I want to move on to the demo I want to, plead to the demo gods. Hope it works. Can we switch the? Great. So what we have here, the setup was described briefly by Haris. We have the simulation software running in different simulation softwares essentially run different sections of the power grid and different abstractions. We have low-level electrical characteristics simulated in MATLAB, and then we have lower-level grid connections simulated in PowerWorld. This is the synthetic benchmark model that Haris talked about before. And we have here a 750 relay device that's connected to the simulation model through a National Instruments data acquisition device. And essentially, the hardware here controls the virtual circuit breaker on bus number 8, the 10.7 megawatt load. Now, I want to begin by just pinging the device. There it is. And now I can move on to fingerprinting the device using the technique I mentioned before. Essentially, I read off certain Modbus registers, and the script returns G750 if it does identify one such device, or if it doesn't, it returns not G750, like the hot dog, not hot dog app if you watch Silicon Valley. Now we can move on to changing the passcode of this device. And at the moment, stage fright. At the moment, the encrypted passcode is DJEABHKC. I wish I had a handheld camera here. But essentially what this script does is it goes and extracts the encrypted passcode registers. It reverses the passcode, it unlocks the device, and then it relocks it such that the encrypted passcode is dead beef, which is always cool. You can see that the encrypted passcode I just read off, and then the passcode value for that is what's shown there. And the passcode value now is dead beef here. Again, you could ask the front row guys to attest to that later. But so far, nothing changed in the simulation model here. Everything is the same, and that's expected because we didn't mess with any of the operational set points of the relay. We just queried some Modbus registers to fingerprint the device, and then we changed the passcode, but we didn't actually change any of the operational set points. But we can now move on to a more elaborate scenario where essentially we put everything together, we fingerprint the device, and if it's a G750, we read off the encrypted passcode, reverse it, change it to lock the legitimate operators out, and then change one of the set points and set its threshold to a very low value. Specifically, we changed the phase time over current pickup to 0.1, which is very low, such that the device always sends the trip command back. Even if you close the command manually, it will still send the trip command later. And yeah, deal with it. And here it is. So I don't know, probably it's more visible that a green light is now on instead of a red light. It's like the opposite of traffic lights. A red light is good, the green light is bad. Green light means open breaker. So now the breaker is de-energized. So power electricity is not flowing. We can see that on the parallel simulation, we can see that the circuit breaker controlling that 10.7 megawatt load is now open in the simulation model. And we can also see the increased strain on some of the power lines or the difference in the power flows. And we can also do more elaborate studies further by opening more circuit breakers. We can do that with having more relays in a hardware in a loop setup, or we could, for example, perform analysis like contingency analysis, like Haris mentioned before. And with that, I want to pass the stage to Michalis, who's going to talk about.
Thank you, Tasso. So we presented this vulnerability, and when we discovered it, we immediately reported it to the General Electric PSI EARTH, Product Security Incident Response Team, in 2016. It was immediately acknowledged, and we started close collaboration towards fixing the vulnerability, and the patch also came out later in 2016. A specific CV has been assigned to it, and an advisory is out. There seems to be some confusion about the actual score. It was first reported as 9.8 because the attack complexity was considered to be low. Then it was changed to 8.1 that stayed with the advisory, the ICS advisory. But now the CV came out a few days ago, and it goes back to 9.8. We reported that to General Electric, and they'll work with the ICS EARTH to understand why it went back to 9.8. But the CWE is there, the 261. Again, the vulnerability has two parts. One is that you can get the Modbus the encrypted passcode through Modbus out without authentication. That's the first part. And the second part is that there's a homebrew algorithm employed, so you can reverse it if you have enough passcodes to perform a chosen ciphertext attack, chosen plaintext, sorry. So the mitigation that the latest firmwares of the affected families is employing is that it removes the ability to retrieve the encrypted passcode either through the screen, as we can see here, or through Modbus. However, there's no change in the encryption algorithm, and when that was first reported to us by General Electric as a fix, we, as security researchers, we commented that everything identified should also be changed. But their response was that it's a very old device coming from the 1990s. It has very limited processing power and limited memory, and the encryption algorithm cannot be changed. So the other thing I wanted to discuss is whether there's any connection to CRASHOVERRIDE, whether this can be used by CRASHOVERRIDE or in Destroyer. As I was making the slide, I didn't have myself enough information about it. I learned more yesterday. It seems that this specific malware was implementing mostly ISC protocols. However, the completeness of the framework hints that it should be very easy to port other industrial protocols. However, Modbus is not really used in the electrical grid, right? And the device supports other protocols which are not affected by this specific vulnerability. The other thing is that CRASHOVERRIDE was never meant to be unique to a vendor. It's process aware. It understands how the grid operations work, but it's not unique to a vendor. It traverses the network and works using industrial protocols. There seems to be a hint that this has some information about specific vulnerability of a Siemens relay. So we don't know whether there's a bigger database of vulnerabilities of power grid devices in place. So to that, to leave some time for questions, the conclusion slide, which will not come to as a surprise for people who understand power grid security. So the first thing that I want to emphasize is that, again, there's a need for a mindset of comprehensive security, right? And this is especially important in this case because if you just go and check the box for password protected access for your device, this G device will do it for you. But then you disregard the fact that the device was built in the 90s, and probably the security back then, the security mindsets were very different. So you have to think security in a comprehensive fashion and not just checking boxes. The second thing that also came out during our discussion with General Electric is at some point, and then the WannaCry virus was spreading uncontrollably, it was around the same time. At some point, we have to stop hiding behind air gaps, hiding behind isolated networks at DMZs, and to have a proper firmware upgrade culture. We need to be able to have the state-of-the-art firmware in our device because you never know how the attacker is going to infiltrate your network. And the last thing is that this is the first vulnerability we ever reported. Well, we're proud of it. We're happy to be here. But I have to admit we're kind of scared in the beginning, how the vendor react, right? When you point out a flaw in a critical device, you never know what the reaction will be on the other side. We've read horror stories on the internet about this. However, it ended up being a very productive collaboration. We learned a lot in the process from General Electric, and Even though it took us more than a year to come out in public and talk about it, it has been a very fruitful year. We learned a lot, and again, personally, as an educator and academic, we do promote ethical hacking. We do promote the right way of disclosing vulnerabilities, right? It's okay to wait for a year or 2 or 3, and then, of course, we believe that raising awareness and exposing things is also pushing things forward in interesting ways and fast forwards things, right? So a good balance between the two is needed. Ethical hacking is needed, but we should not be hiding always. Give some time. We gave more than a year for this, for the paths to go and be updated in the systems. And that was, again, a very productive collaboration. And I want to emphasize the value of ethical hacking. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Clapping?